Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome everybody to the book launch of an exciting new book, Curriculum Renewal for Islamic Education. And here today we have the three co-editors of this unique book. I'm going to give the briefest of overviews of the book, and then I'm going to invite the co-editors to explain to you what the book is all about. From my understanding, this book is a first in terms of the fact that it provides impetus for curriculum renewal from a wide variety of disciplines and from a wide variety of contributors who are both scholars of Islamic education and practitioners and educators and teachers and school leaders. So it's a very exciting book. Now, to introduce the co-editors and to, well, actually, first, I'll just tell you a little bit who I am and why I'm moderating this launch. I work very closely with the three co-editors as an adjunct research fellow at the Center for Islamic Thought and Education at the University of South Australia, of which two of the co-editors are also professors, Dr. Mohammed Abdallah and Dr. Nadim Memon. And Dr. Mariam Al-Hashmi is a professor, assistant professor of education in the United Arab Emirates at Zayed University. And she has many years experience leading schools and teaching, and also now in educational scholarship. Dr. Mohammed Abdallah had his start in Islamic Studies, and his area of expertise is Islamic Studies and integration within Islamic education for the formation of faith as it's taught across children, youth, and early adulthood. And he also received the Order of Australia recently, which is the highest recognition one can get in education. And he started the Center for Islamic Thought and Education at the University of South Australia, which now has been joined by Dr. Nadim Memon. And this center offers one of the first graduate certificates in Islamic education. So it's really an innovative place for thinking and development of the field of Islamic education. And Nadim Memon, as you know, is a longtime scholar and educator, as he started previously the ITEP program, the Islamic Teacher Education Program, which is where I first met Nadim. I took that program myself several years ago, and I was also starting a PhD at that time. And he was really one of the people who inspired me to actually go further in my research and education. He was one of the founding inspirational figures for me. And ironically, Dr. Mohammed Abdallah was the external examiner of my PhD research. So I am intimately connected with those two scholars. And as for Dr. Mariam Al-Hashmi, our paths have sort of crossed, but over different places and times. We found that we had studied with similar people, but we hadn't met until we walked together along the sea in Dubai one day last year. So I was so happy that we could actually meet in person. So without further ado, I'm going to invite each of the co-editors to engage with the following question. For some reason, I'm not able to move my screen. Why is that? This is a technical issue.
You might just have to press enter, Claire.
Every time I press a button, it makes that noise.
If you press enter.
Oh,
there we go.
Oh, that's amazing. Okay, so why this book, why now? I think what I'd like to do first is to ask Dr. Nadim Memon to describe to us how this book came into being, and then we'll go through all of the different sections of the book. So Dr. Nadim, could you explain why this book and why now?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Welcome everyone to the webinar. We're really excited about this book coming out. It's been a long time coming. I think for all of us in the field of education, of Islamic education, Islamic schooling across the globe, we've probably recognized over the years that there is a concerted call for curriculum, robust curriculum, in Islamic schooling in the West, but also in Islamic education in Muslim majority contexts. And just about everybody wants to know, can we develop a curriculum? Do we have a curriculum? What would a curriculum look like? And this book was really a response to all of those questions and requests that us as academics, but I think globally, educators who are in the field have been asking for. And to say that, somebody can come up and put a curriculum in front of us that integrates Islam across the curriculum, or that offers, a really renewed conception of what Islamic studies could look like. But I think we've all come to a realization that one curriculum wouldn't necessarily meet the needs of every different context and every different school's aspirations. So this book really aspired to do something different. And rather than give a curriculum, rather than give a package and say, here's a curriculum, run with it, this book says, here is the thought process, here's the constructive critique, here are some suggestions as a way forward to empower educators in your own context, in our own context, to do curriculum renewal ourselves. So it's really, in terms of why this book, why now, at least from my perspective, the intent was to bring together educators, scholars, academics from around the world. 18 of us have been working on this book for 3 years now, to really look at each different aspect that comprises Islamic education or Islamic studies across the curriculum, and to ask ourselves, what would we do differently? And what you have in front of you is a book that really provides that sense of guidance.
So can I just jump in there and ask you, Nadeem, so what you're saying is that because every site of Islamic education has different needs and is located in a different context, you wanted to provide some sort of large picture thinking and concepts and principles to enable schools to devise their own curriculum renewal?
Yeah, I think in many schools that we've come across, either in schools or in Muslim majority countries, you have a lot of, at a state level, at a state or province level, you have curriculum initiatives that are happening. And most people have questions and they're looking for ways of thinking about it. So in schools, you'll have curriculum development teams, or in state departments, you'll have, state curriculum committees. And this book is intended to give exactly what you said, Claire. It's about giving principles, it's about giving guidelines, it's about giving thought processes in how to develop a curriculum that suits your own context and your own needs.
Right. Okay, so I have some questions in terms of what is transformation, whether we need a standardized curriculum for Muslim students the world over, and the fact that we, as an Ummah, we lack sort of higher authority or even a higher educational authority. Those are 3 themes I'd like to pick up later. So just so they're sort of cooking in the back of your mind. But in the meantime, I would like to ask each of you to introduce a part of the book. The book is in 3 sections. So part 1 is regarding Islamic studies curricula and what a revival of that would look like. So can I invite Dr. Muhammad Abdullah to talk a little bit about that?
Yes, of course. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, salatu salam ala rasulullah. Assalamu alaikum, and thank you very much for hosting this. Islamic studies, as we know, is pivotal in any Islamic school. In fact, what is an Islamic school without Islamic studies? And the first section of this book deals with Islamic studies curricula, and it does so in a number of ways. First, it recognizes the importance of Islamic studies for Islamic schools, both at the madrasa level, but also the Islamic schooling level, whether private or public schools. And secondly, it examines a number of Islamic studies curricula some of the most important or most famous ones in a critical way or from a critical perspective without undermining the tremendous effort and achievements of schools and previous pioneers. So it is not a criticism for the sake of criticism, but it is from the Islamic perspective, perhaps it's a muhasabah. It's a self-introspection of how we are teaching Islam in Islamic schools. How is Islamic studies being presented? So an examination of multiple Islamic studies curricula, the ones that are most often used in Western context and some majority Muslim context, are examined. And in doing so, we've looked at how it is being taught, or what is being taught, the realities of Islamic studies curricula today, and the ideals of Islamic studies curricula. And so in doing so, we examined, for example, how the Quran is taught, and whether content-wise and pedagogy-wise, and provided some suggestions as how to possibly that can be renewed, right? And the same thing, say, with fiqh or jurisprudence or practical living. What is being taught, and how can we perhaps renew that in ways that are responsive to the learner? And we've done the same thing with other aspects of Islamic studies in a way to tap onto the renewal process that has begun some time ago, but also to help inspire schools to perhaps re-examine the way they are presenting Islamic studies to their learners in ways that can make it more engaging, more relevant, more contextual, non-repetitive, and I guess helps them to appreciate and value Islam when it is being taught to them.
Okay, thank you so much for that clear overview. I was just wondering if you had to sort of identify the biggest contribution this book would make to the core Islamic studies of an Islamic school, whether it be informal, higher education. What do you think that the greatest contribution of this book would be to that context, those contexts?
I think the biggest contribution, if we're looking at Islamic schools per se, then perhaps the biggest contribution is allowing schools to become more responsive to students or the learners' needs. So from my own empirical research, I have found when I spoke to students in various Islamic schools, I found that these students love to learn about Islam.
Right.
They love it, and it's interesting because sometimes we hear the statements that students are not engaged because they don't love Islam or they don't want to learn about Islam, and that is not true. I found exactly the opposite to that they love to learn about Islam, they want to learn about Islam, but often the way it is taught and the pedagogies that are used are not relevant or not engaging or not contextual and so forth. And so those students that begin with a sense of interest to wanting to learn more about Islam in Islamic studies in this case, that interest is very quickly diminishes in the senior years. And if the intent of Islamic schools is to cater for students, then I think one of the biggest contributions of this book is to help educators, but also leaders of schools, reorient their Islamic studies in ways that can be responsive to their own learners and their own contexts.
Yes, I feel strongly when I read the book that the learner is really within the pages, like kept at the front of mind. And I think that's an excellent approach to take. And in my own empirical research, I too have noticed that there is a thirst for wanting to learn about Islam, but that is also compounded with this idea of wanting to belong to a community. And I think that's something that as educators, we can really capitalize on, is that we have a global community that's based on some shared principles. And that is very empowering for youth, especially when what it leads to ultimately is their own self-development, and it gives them tools with which to face the challenges of life. And something else that I've noticed in the book, and I also noticed in my own research, is that the role of adults and children. So, there's a lot of buzz about sort of learner-centered curricula. And one thing I think is quite unique about an Islamic approach is that there is always a close relationship between a developing person and a more experienced person. So I've also noticed that within the text. And in a way, every single author of the book is a more experienced other for who we can forge a relationship.
Yeah, sure. And these are very good themes that you've raised. I guess one of the issues that, you know, young Western Muslims face, it's this idea of identity crisis, right? And often it's a host of reasons. We can't pinpoint identity crisis to a singular cause, but there are multiple causes. And I would say these are internal and external causes. So for example, Islamophobia is a cause that may lead to identity crisis. So how do we engage with the issues that are internal to the Muslim community and external to the Muslim community, using Islamic studies as a medium to try to empower these young people to have a sense of belonging, but also to feel more confident about their Islamic identity in a context that is possibly quite, you know, pejorative and negative towards Islam and Muslims.
Yes, inshallah. So that's an excellent introduction to the first part of the book. The second, those are some of the chapters in the first part of the book. As Dr. Mohammed had explained, that each one looks at a different element of Islamic studies and looks with a critical but supportive eye of what has already been done. So not to build upon the work that's already there, rather than sort of tear it apart. And then present some ideals and some ideas of how we might move towards those ideals. So the second part of the book, I would like to ask Dr. Nadim Memon to describe. It's entitled Islamic Worldview Shaping Curriculum. Could we just start with that title? That's a very interesting title.
Yeah, and I think just to build on what you just said, Claire, that, you know, the entire book has really been informed by the pioneers in the field. I mean, I think we have to acknowledge the 30, 40 years worth of scholarship that has been done in this area of curriculum. And I think we as a collective of contributors to this book are indebted to those that have done work on Islamic studies curriculum and integrating Islam across the curriculum. You know, the works that have been done around textbooks, learning resources, curriculum frameworks. Really, this book was meant to be, standing on their shoulders and seeing how we can potentially contribute to building off of what's been done. And that connects me to this idea of Islamic worldview, because a lot of, you know, especially in Western contexts, in English-speaking Muslim minority contexts, like the United States, Australia, Canada, the UK, where there's, you know, a growing number of Islamic schools, the aspiration for many schools has been, how do we integrate Islam across the state mandated or national mandated curricula? So how do we take science or humanities or English or health and physical education, and how do we put or bring Islam into it? And we wanted to challenge that conception of integration, because we feel that that conception of integration assumes that we're taking a state mandated curriculum without really a critical perspective to it, and we are sprinkling or appending Islam onto it in ways where we might find it fits, but it becomes very sporadic at best. And I think that's one of the reasons why a lot of Islamic schools, what they try to do is they'll try to come up with a theme-based approach. I know I've seen some schools that use curriculum planning team meetings where they'll take a theme across different learning areas or grade levels or subject content, and they'll try to bring Islam thematically through questions of inquiry or through Islamically based themes. Our approach to teaching from an Islamic worldview, I think, inshallah, hopefully, extends this idea of integration by saying that we would begin with the foundation in an Islamic worldview first, and then use that foundation of an Islamic worldview to look at and to achieve the learning outcomes that are in a state mandated curriculum. So it's the opposite, it's the other way around. Your starting point isn't the state curriculum, your starting point is what is an Islamic worldview, and then how do you look at that in relation to, and there's been work, the works of Dr. Frida Shama and Dr. Ann Muslimani and many others have written about this idea of an Islamic worldview as your starting point. And I think we're really, again, building on that. But the 4 chapters in this section, I think, really speak to looking at this from a different perspective.
Yeah, I see. So it is an integration, but it has a different starting point, if you will. So
yeah, in different ways, and I'll give you an example that, if you look at Dr. Susan Douglas' chapter on the humanities, it's on history, but it intersects with social studies. And she makes a really good argument where she says, the way that history has been taught commonly is through sort of like a linear approach. It's, you have a timeline and you go through a linear approach. And as a result of that linear approach, we've applied that approach to Islamic history as well. So we teach Islamic history, let's say the Sirah, for example, or Islamic civilizations, from one time period to the next in a linear approach. And she challenges that by saying, what if we looked at this from what she says, a new world history approach, which is a more holistic approach that's based on time periods, as opposed to a linear trace of time, a time period. And within that time period, you're looking at different civilizations that existed at the same time period. So you're doing inter-civilizational history at the same time, as opposed to talking about the Ottoman Empire and then the Roman Empire as 2 completely separate empires. Or you're looking at one time period and asking yourself what existed at that time period across the globe, not just in Muslim societies, but globally. And I think that in itself, I think it allows for some of the aspirations that many Islamic schools have, which is how do we connect across communities? How do we build understanding, intercultural understanding? But at the same time, how do we reinforce who we are within a state-mandated curriculum?
Yeah, and it's interesting because even there were interconnections and communications happening within those time periods across civilizations, and I sometimes marvel at the fact that I just came back from Damascus, and the history is like, it's right there, it's present. So I was in the mosque of Imam Ibn al-Arabi, and there's something about a presence of the history that I like. This idea of sort of moving away from chronology and thinking about the fact that we exist across different time periods simultaneously, if you will.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Go on.
So, oh yeah, Dr.
I was
Mohammed.
just gonna add just a point on that teaching history, the way Nadeem has mentioned. It does 2 things also. It inspires this idea of interconnectedness of civilizations. That's number 1, but also it makes the teaching of history quite interesting and exciting and relevant for the learner. If we come back to the learner, just to give you an example, if we were to ask the question, what is the relationship between Ptolemy, At-Tusi ibn al-Shatir, and Nicholas Copernicus? Now, and if you look at that, you say, well, there is no relationship. But if we teach history in a holistic way, in an interconnected way, present that to the learner, and you see that 3 civilizations, the Greek, the Islamic, and the Western, were actually interconnected in this particular historical period and in this particular scientific discipline. And can you imagine how the learner would receive that? Immediately they feel that interconnectedness, but also they feel empowered. And I think it can easily break down the otherness and help students appreciate one another's civilization and one another's cultural background.
Which would have implications for today, I would want to suggest. It could possibly help them integrating between different cultures, which many Muslim children today move through many different cultures, sometimes even in a day. So it could have implications on the way that they navigate. Okay, I would like to turn now to part 3.
Sorry, Claire, if I could just, I just want to make another comment about those chapters, if I may.
Okay,
Do
sure.
we have a minute for it?
Yes.
You know, I just wanted to comment and say that the whole idea of Islamic worldview, which I think is really rich in this section in particular, the chapters, each of the chapters here provide actual practical ways of thinking about the challenges we have in Islamic schooling to do this integration work. So, you know, the music chapter, chapter 10 on arts, fine arts and music actually provides clarity on what's been deemed permissible and impermissible across different perspectives held by scholars, along with lesson plans of what this could look like sample lesson plans that are used in Islamic schools. The chapter on chapter 9 on health and physical education provides great insights of how an Islamic worldview is based on what Dylan Chown calls orientating anchors, concepts like afia, well-being, and how that reshapes the way we think about health and physical education, not just about dress and what's appropriate and what's haram and acceptable. And it's more about how do we think about a strength-based approach to the holistic value of sport as worship, as physical exercise as worship, which really shifts the way we think about it. And the chapter by Dr. Omar Qureshi on science, I think it really, I mean, mashallah, all of these chapters provide a lot of food for thought, but science is one of those subjects that we have been grappling with for a long time in Islamic schooling, where, you know, we either try to bring in an Islamic perspective into the science curriculum and append a creationist perspective or add some ayat of the Quran, but it often becomes very tangential. And what Dr. Omar Qureshi offers is what he calls a principled methodological approach, where he says we first develop a strong understanding of what's currently being taught. So understand the current standpoint that science is being taught from, and the critique from within among the scientific community of the positions in the current science curriculum. But then he speaks about bringing in or teaching a philosophy of science combined with a strong understanding of an Islamic worldview that allows students to become confident in being able to straddle between an Islamic perspective and what they're seeing in science curriculum. And I think that the chapter provides, I think, a pretty clear roadmap for educators that are grappling with the science curriculum in how to go about integrating some of the ideas that I just mentioned. So I just want to reiterate that these chapters really provide, I think, a framework across the 4 chapters of how an Islamic worldview can really reshape the way we think about state-mandated curriculum that we're all, you know, often trying to draw from and teach to.
It seems like it actually goes back to something that Dr. Muhammad said in the beginning, which was like a deep sort of self-knowledge and awareness, as well as a deep knowledge and awareness of context, and then how one can build between the two. This sounds very exciting. So the third part of the book, which I would like to invite Dr. Mariam to speak to, Islam-inspired curriculum renewal. So could you please give us an overview of the third part of the book, Dr. Mariam?
Yes, so based on what we've heard from Professor Muhammad Abdullah and from Nadeem, we see that this is a huge task that we're talking about, and it's one that many schools are struggling with. Actually, after sending the announcement about this event, I've received multiple messages from practitioners and educators around the world who told me that this is the very task that we are busy with now, and we need we appreciate the guidance. And this probably answers your question of why now and why this book. So it's a task that Muslim educators are busy with. So when we talk about curriculum renewal, this part sheds light on how this process is done. How do we remap the curriculum, whether it is a whole school curriculum or the Islamic Studies curriculum? How is this work done based on Islamic teachings and principles? How is it done in a holistic and an integrative manner? And what would be some distinct pedagogies of Islamic education? And how could they be implemented in our classrooms today in a way that meet learners' needs? In part 3, there are also some concrete recommendations of how this work can be done. So for example, chapter 14 provides guidance on how can educators on a school-wide scale go about redeveloping and action planning their curricula, whether this is done in a thematic way or a complete integrative manner. So a lot of tips on what might help, what would support this process, and what should be avoided. If we go to the chapters, I think an important, maybe a starting point here is the idea of renewal, which this book is all about. We need to remember that when we talk about renewal, it's based on the grounding of Islamic scholarly and spiritual tradition. And this is done through a reliable, systematic methodology, and it's governed by valid criteria, where we want to preserve the roots, but also look at the needs and renew in ways that are solve today's challenges. In this process, as we will see in this part and throughout the book, it's important to discern bad implementations of the tradition, because many times we look at existing models where there are lots of inherited implementations that are sometimes confused with what is in line with the Islamic philosophy of education or Islamic principles.
Dr. Mariam, can I just ask you, there was one part in the book that seems very, very important, and it's in the title of the book. And I just wondered if you could shed some light on it. Quoting the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar in Cairo, Sheikh Ahmed al-Tayyib, and he describes the difference between renewal of the tradition, okay, and that of tradition and renewal. And I was hoping that you could shed some light on that, because this idea of renewal is very interesting in our field.
Yes, so the first concept of tradition renewal, تجديد التراث, this is what I have just explained, which actually is about going to starting from the tradition, understanding the tradition, and deriving the principles from the tradition through a systematic methodology and proper criteria in ways that would solve the problems and meet the needs of the learners in our time. Now, the other concept which Sheikh Ahmed al-Tayyib speaks about is that of tradition and renewal. I think this is the translation, التراث والتجديد. Yes, where the start is the needs of our time, and the tradition becomes reduced to be only the means. I think it's similar to, if we talk about curriculum renewal, that would be similar to the approach that Nadim has described, where you would think about, okay, we will start with what seems to be meeting the needs, and then we would go to the tradition to pick and choose what might be match, what might match.
Okay.
Regardless of whether it's aligned with the principles or not.
Okay, thank you so much. That is a really beautiful explanation. And one thing I just wanted you to speak to is the fact that we're talking, this book is intended for a global audience, and it draws from a global body of scholars who are global. What does the book have to offer Muslim majority countries who may not be, as minority cultures are, sort of, in a way, sort of struggling for survival in the face of a larger culture? So what would the book offer to a Muslim majority context?
Yes, so in fact, the variations are many, but we know that we live in a village, and there are lots of similarities between the challenges that we see in different countries around the world, including Muslim majority countries, where the challenges might be slightly different in the outlook, but probably they're more attributed to the same root causes. So, for example, one of the main challenges is the lack of curricular frameworks when it comes to Islamic studies. I think that's shared between between Muslim majority and Muslim minority countries. So schools need guidance towards what could be a conceptual framework that we can develop and work based on in our curriculum remapping or curriculum development endeavors in a coherent manner. Yeah. Another challenge is that of relevance. Again, we all share this. Many times Islamic education is far from the students' realities. It doesn't speak to the intellectual, the spiritual challenges that our children and youth face today. And that's also something that the book addresses in multiple chapters. And I believe we are in a stage where we need some frame of reference that merges research and practice in a way that would foster conversations between Islamic education, educators on different venues. I think that's a valuable contribution to educators in Muslim majority countries.
Thank you so much for that. There's a couple of things I just want to ask all three of you, and one of them involves varying interpretations of Islam. Can anybody speak to, I mean, our ummah is diverse. We have different ways of interpreting and understanding Islam. How does the book really include different interpretational approaches?
Professor Muhammad, would you like to respond to that, or shall I? Dr. Mariam?
You go ahead, start. Inshallah, we can follow.
I think it's a very good question, Claire. I think we have taken that into consideration from the outset. We tried to ensure that in each chapter we take into consideration the fact that there are different contexts, there's different orientations, and there's different perspectives that are held. And in many cases, we've tried to speak to those distinctions. And I gave that example, especially from I think the art and the music chapter, one where it's pretty common to have different perspectives and orientations. Those are expressed. So I think throughout the book we've been cognizant of it. I think it's one of the founding pillars that we all spoke about as a collective when we endeavored on this book, that we want to be cognizant of the fact that we're writing not from a personal perspective necessarily, but we are cognizant of the varying perspectives that exist.
Yeah, can I also add to that? So that's absolutely correct, as Dr. Nadeem has mentioned. And I think what the book does is, as has been already stipulated, it provides that framework. And it's not prescriptive as such, but rather provides a framework. So to give you an example, when we say Islamic studies needs to be relevant, contextual, we're not saying that Islamic studies has to prescribe to a particular school of thought or a particular, sect in inverted commas, but we're saying whatever school of thought your school is following, when it comes to the teaching of Islam in the school, then there are a number of, fundamental principles or frameworks that school needs to consider. For example, what I call in my chapter on fiqh, the learner responsive fiqh, right? A fiqh or jurisprudence that is actually responsive to the learner. So it needs to be flexible, adaptable, practical, relevant, objective, contextual, non-repetitive, and engaging. Now, regardless of which school of thought one is following, regardless of the orientation that one is adopting at one school, is irrelevant in this case, because whether you belong to this or that, if you don't make your teaching of Islam in this particular case relevant and contextual and engaging for the students, they're going to lose interest, right? And so we're not saying you have to teach Islam in this or in this prescriptive way. And that's why I guess one of the constructive criticisms of the do's and don'ts in the teaching of Islam is that it lacks that engaging aspect, or that aspect that provides relevance for the student himself or herself.
Okay, so are you saying, actually, when I look back over the chapters, it looks as if each one is sort of including a high level pedagogical approach rather than a sort of topic or content? You're not telling people what to teach, you're teaching them, you're suggesting how to teach it?
Professor Muhammad, would you like to go?
Yeah, well, it's not in certain chapters. Again, if I refer to the chapter on fiqh, based on we're not saying what to teach exactly.
Yes.
But what we are saying is these are some ideas based on students' responses and experiences as to what you may consider when you want to teach Islam. So, for example, often the repeated concern of learners was that contemporary issues are not discussed or taught in the classroom. So now, instead of us saying, well, this is the contemporary issues that you should teach in your classroom, what we're saying, each school should be able to identify those issues that are relevant to their own students and teach them in ways that have an Islamic worldview, an underpinning of an Islamic worldview, that are responsive, that are relevant to the student, that are engaging, and so forth.
The readers of this book will also find guidance on general guidelines on content-related ideas. So they will also find reference to resources that they can refer to in different strands of Islamic studies or subject areas that can be integrated with Islamic education. And this is because when we look at this area of curriculum renewal, we are referring to a shared tradition, while the manifestations are diverse. But there is still the shared tradition, and Dr. Farah Ahmed in part 3 spoke about it when she discussed the concepts. She discussed 4 concepts related to Islamic education, and one of them is the concept of deen, and she speaks about unity through multiplicity. So how can we assure coherence, but also maintain the roots in all cultures?
Okay, inshallah. One thing I wanted to just ask you very briefly before we move on to the Q&A, very briefly, is given that there is no higher authority or educational authority, and I do know that some curriculum developers have aimed for a standardized curriculum so that every child, Muslim child in the world across the Ummah, wherever they're located, would have there would be certain benchmarks for their learning over time. How do you feel about that? Can anybody speak to this kind of idea? Is this something that's an ideal, or is this something that's not an ideal?
I'm happy to step in first. I think I can see the rationale for a standardized curriculum because we've had such a variance of Islamic studies curricula being developed globally. And I think in some ways, I think many of us are looking for something that raises the bar. So a standardized curriculum is to create that sense of consistency. But I would be wary of something that becomes standardized as opposed to potentially upholding high standards. And I think what this book is trying to promote is that it gives us a way of thinking about high standards that we then within our own school contexts are able to lead a form of curriculum development that suits the aspirations of our own schools. So it's not standardized, but we do hold ourselves to a high standard.
Okay, excellent. Does anybody else want to add? Okay, Dr. Nadeem, did you want to talk about the next step?
Well, maybe we can get to that after the questions. If you want,
Okay.
Can we go to the questions first?
Sure. So let's open the floor up to questions now. I believe that there are a couple in the chat box. Maybe
Yeah, I can see the Q&A.
Now. Okay.
Should we just take turns maybe? I mean, I think we can all see the Q&A. Dr. Mariam or Professor Muhammad,
sure.
if we just want to.
So the first, is there any chapter regarding interfaith dialogue and harmony? No, there isn't, not in this book.
But it features in different chapters, does it not?
Yes, it does feature in different chapters, but I mean, this is again one of those. So for example, when we say what is relevant to the learners in a particular Islamic school, so some Islamic school may not see interfaith dialogue perhaps as a necessary subject in their Islamic studies for that particular school, right? But others may see it as necessary. And therefore, what the book provides in this case, again, that framework, that underpinnings of an Islamic worldview, but also a way of thinking how to make the discussion of interfaith dialogue relevant and contemporary to the lives of the students.
Excellent.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think there's limitations when you do a book, and there's a number of chapters I think that we would have liked to include. For example, we don't have a chapter on Arabic, on the language of Arabic. We don't have in part 2 of the book, we didn't go through every single subject area that we could have for teaching from an Islamic worldview. But I think what we're hoping for in the book is that it provides the necessary foundations for developing that curriculum framework. And this links to the second question by the anonymous attendee that says, what is the best and relevant Islamic curriculum framework that you recommend for independent schools in the Americas, for example? And I think, at least from my end, my response would be that this book is hoping that it gives you the thought process to develop a curriculum framework for your school. I think one of the things that we would probably encourage every school is to develop a curriculum philosophy or a curriculum approach, call it a 1-page, 2-page curriculum approach that defines how you're going to approach Islamic education or Islamic studies and how you're going to approach the teaching of the state mandated curriculum from an Islamic perspective. How are you going to approach that? And to use the book hopefully as a way to articulate your framework. And then you will draw on age-appropriate materials and learning outcomes from different places in relation to your framework. But what we're missing currently in most Islamic schools is that framework. What we often do is we draw on materials and curricula outcomes, but we don't necessarily have a sense of what it is that defines our school's approach.
Excellent. It looks like there's a question.
Dr. Clay just froze.
Yeah, I mean, feel free, Dr. Mariam, Professor Muhammad, I think let's read these and let's work through them. If you see one that you feel you'd like to take a lead on.
Comment. Go on.
There's a question here about by Brother Muhammad Azim about a special chapter for school leadership team. I'd say that most chapters have addressed the school leaders in ways that would support their work and curriculum renewal. You will find some case studies from schools that have gone through this path and have had some successful experiences in this regard. There's also a chapter in part 3 by Dr. Seema Imam, where she provides advice to educators, and she suggests practical means such as going through an accreditation process where the school community would review the founding documents like the vision, mission, the values, and also the curriculum in its entirety, and then decide on an action plan, involve stakeholders. I think these are very practical tips that support school leaders as they go through the curriculum renewal and integration process.
You back, Dr. Claire? We can't hear you.
Sorry, my internet cut out for some reason. I'm sorry about that. Here's a good question that might lead into what you were going to talk about, Dr. Nadeem. Is there a chance to provide sessions for Islamic educators worldwide to guide them on how to use the book and how it will help them develop their own Islamic curriculum? This is a huge need to do so.
Yeah, and maybe Claire, if you can share your screen and we can put that slide up and I'll respond to Sarah's question. So we do plan to provide sort of like a professional development opportunity that supports the book. I think it's really important because the book, is a book, and I think for us to be able to gain the most from it, one of the opportunities I think that we have is to really work with educators collaboratively, globally, to have the conversation. So through the Center for Islamic Thought and Education, we're very excited to be offering an online professional development short course that's going to start in September 2021. And the short course is really based on this book on curriculum renewal. But what's going to be distinct is we'll be reading it together, but we'll also be thinking about developing that curriculum framework for your school or your school association. We'll be looking at issues of what's your curriculum orientation, what's the development process, what are the key foundational pieces of understanding that are required for developing a curriculum renewal action plan. So I've left this here, and for those of you that are interested, you can get in touch with us at the Center for Islamic Thought to at least fill out the expression of interest, so that you can hold your spot for the first cohort in September 2021.
Great.
But yeah, a really good question. I think it is very important. There's been a lot of conversations in the last 2 weeks since the book is launched, and I know we will be doing multiple book launches as well, inshallah, in the coming weeks with some of the other contributors of the book. This one we really focused on the co-editors of the book, but in future subsequent book launches we'll be having an opportunity to engage with some of the contributors of the book, and that inshallah will lead to this professional development opportunity that educators can really engage with a collaborative spirit for the professional development.
Great, and that actually leads to another question here. Do you think it's even better to encourage diversity in curriculum and find ways to share concrete lesson plans and course models rather than having a standardized curriculum? So that is a little bit what you were just speaking about, Dr. Nadeem, having the other contributors engage and share ideas. How might we widen that?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's probably the way to go, because every time I've seen a curriculum that's drafted that lands on the desk of another school, they often say, but this is not what we were looking for. So it's like every school is looking for something, but when they see it, it's not what they're looking for. So probably the way forward for most schools, I know it's a bit, it's time intensive and it seems daunting to develop your own curriculum in-house, but that's the way to have the most impact, because you know your context best and the aspirations of your school. And we all know that when you have two schools across the street from each other, they often don't see eye to eye in terms of the types of Islamic education they aspire for. So it only makes sense that you know, we do exactly what you just mentioned.
And you do mention in the book that this is a strength of our global community. It may be challenging, but it's ultimately a strength, is our diversity.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
And this
Okay.
would probably, just adding on what has been said, this would relate to how do we view curriculum, or what do we mean about when we say curriculum? We are not restricted by textbooks. We're looking also at a dynamic level that is about the interaction between the learners and the teachers, and this cannot be unified in any way.
Amazing. And that actually relates to the next question. Does the book offer innovative and relevant assessment methods for Islamic studies? Islam is not a to know subject, but a to do and to live subject.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. In the last sentence is pertinent. The book doesn't do that at this stage. And as Nadeem said, we could add another 20 chapters to the book. but that's a very important point, and it doesn't do that. But that's something that can be considered and discussed in more details, absolutely.
Similar ideas to that might inform answering this question are about the holistic approach towards Islamic education and Islamic studies, where we don't reduce Islamic education to the factual level, and therefore this is not going to be what we would assess. Rather, it's looking holistically at the learner in ways that are based on on Islamic principles of who the learner is, where it starts with the soul, the intellect, the emotions, and روح, العقل, القلب, and the nafs, or the ego.
I would like to add to that question. You know, many of the scholars do talk about the unity of knowledge and action. So I don't think it's to say that Islam is not a to know subject. It is. And maybe one way to understand what we know is to actually look at what we do and how we live. And I've often wondered that, you know, I mean, real Islamic learning one can know that learning is taking place when somebody by choice wants to live or to act in a certain way. And then you know that that learning has been internalized because they're actually acting and engaging in a certain way. Can we talk a tiny bit more about assessment? I mean, I'm sure that assessment comes into some of the chapters.
I don't think assessment was explicitly suggested or addressed in any of the chapters necessarily. It was more in terms of curriculum design, but I think by virtue of the foundations of how each of the authors or contributors are explaining that the subject should be approached, that in itself gives you guidance on how to assess. Because if you go back to the fiqh chapter that Professor Muhammad spoke about, and you have those, I think it was 5 or 6 different key aspects to an Islamic studies fiqh curriculum, those give you the essentials of a rubric to develop a form of assessment. So again, it goes back to your curriculum philosophy. And I think, you know, people are asking about questions about assessment, but there's also questions about structure. And I think using the ideas, the pillars that come out of the chapters will provide you that framework for teaching, but also in terms, well, for curriculum design, but also for teaching and then for assessment. So we can't forget that there's an intersection between this, right? You're designing curriculum, but by virtue of designing curriculum, you have to then redesign the way you teach or rethink the way you actually impart this. Because if you're going to teach fiqh in a different way, if you're going to design curriculum for fiqh in a different way, it requires a different approach to teaching, which then requires a different approach to assessment.
Yes.
If I may briefly, just on this question, quote from Dr. Farah's chapter. She describes the learner being transformed by application of knowledge learned through physical action, reflection, and embodiment, and the fact that to know something is to be something. And she describes how this is done in Shakhsiyya Education School, where the students in their ta'aleem process do not only gain information, but they also have dialogue and discussions in order to develop or build Islamic conceptual frameworks. Maybe that would connect also to the assessment aspect.
Yeah. So yeah, exactly. I mean, there isn't a specific chapter that talks specifically about assessment, but you find threads across all the chapters that can give guidelines and guidance as to how to assess holistically, perhaps, and not just to assess what a student captures cognitively, but also, more importantly, I think the practice and the spiritual. And this is coming back to the perhaps one of the fundamentals of Islamic philosophy education, and that is not the transmission of knowledge, but also help transformation or transforming the learner himself or herself, which begs the question then, to what extent do the learners themselves, the teachers, the educators themselves embody what they want to see in the learner? And so this is all fundamental to the Islamic worldview and fundamental to the philosophy education from an Islamic perspective, that if we want to see that transformation in the learners, it should not be simply about transmitting information and assessing that information, but embodying and manifesting that knowing of Islam, knowledge of Islam, and seeing how we can role model it in ways that can enhance the lives of those learners, and to see the impact, the extent to which the impact of that is on their lives, spiritually, morally. I mean, how many times you go to a school and you walk into the musalla or the mosque of the school, and there is a huge amount of noise, despite the fact that so much is being said about respecting the sanctity and sacredness of the mosque itself. So how do we make Islam living in the lives of students, and how to assess it? These are very important questions, and certainly it should not be done prescriptively, but it should be done innovatively and in ways that can renew the Islam and its understanding in the lives of the learners.
Excellent. Well, we've actually come to the end of our hour, although there are a couple more questions. How would you like to have a look at that quickly, or how do you want to do it?
I think it might be good to wrap up, just to keep with the time commitment that we've made. But I think it's an open invitation to all those that are here on the webinar that, all of us, I'm sure, are willing to engage in ongoing conversations. You have access to our email addresses, and if you don't, online, we can always post them in the chat. But I think we'd all be more than happy to continue the engagement. And I think we will have subsequent opportunities for these sorts of conversations through some upcoming book launches as well. So inshallah, we can continue the conversation there.
Fantastic. I wanted to thank everybody for joining and thank the editors for presenting this exciting new book. Thank you, everybody, and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Take care. Assalamu alaikum.